All right. So again, the deterrence theory is based on the idea that formal punishment, fear of police and arrest, fear of prison or other sanctions, reduce crime. And it's kind of a simple idea, but it can be applied in a variety of ways. And so one of the issues is it general deterrence or special slash specific deterrence. And with general deterrence, the idea is that we punish criminals so that everybody else looking on says, "Holy crap, I don't want that to happen to me," and they stop engaging in crime. So the fence sitters, those who think, maybe I will, maybe I won't, are deterred. Specific deterrence is the idea that the offender themselves, once punished, will become less likely to engage in crime. It's kind of a basic principle of psychology, right? Punishment should reduce that particular behavior. So it revolves around who's being deterred. Deterrence can operate at both a macro, kind of city, state level, or at the micro individual level. And I don't know, I'll talk about that in a bit. The other issue I think to keep in mind when we talk about this is that deterrence can be absolute or marginal, and most of the studies, well, pretty much all the studies are about marginal effects. So it's not like deterrence versus no deterrence. Like, does having police or does having prisons reduce crime? So everybody would believe that, yeah, that's true. That the mere fact we have police, you can't get arrested, you can't go to prison, is going to reduce crime. The real issue is, does adding police officers, does increasing sentence length, does sort of cranking up the punishment reduce crime further? There is, by the way, we do have some evidence on absolute deterrence. If you look at, there's been citywide police strikes a couple times in Canada, and so we have data on what would happen. And unsurprisingly, a lot of crimes go up. The biggest ones that go up are robberies of business and those sorts of things, burglaries. But other things don't go up, which tells you a bit about how deterrence theory works. That violence generally doesn't go up, homicide doesn't go up. People don't start sort of killing each other simply because there's no police or prisons. All right, so we're going to kind of run through what we know from deterrence theory. If you look at general deterrence, the idea that punishing offenders sends a message to everybody else, and you start with severity, so punishment can be certain, severe, and swift. Most of the severity research revolves around the death penalty, and so the idea is if your state has the death penalty for homicide, it's a pretty severe penalty, and people should be less likely to kill other people. The death penalty research is, recently it's been kind of all over, but the vast majority of studies that have ever been done, and we're talking about hundreds of studies, have found that there's a zero effect, that death penalty has no effect on research. There's modern evidence, a couple studies that suggest that the kind of highly publicized death penalty events can reduce some forms of homicide, but there's also recent studies, again, kind of a couple or handful that suggest that the death penalty under certain circumstances actually makes homicide go up, the so-called brutalization effect. So again, in general, the vast majority of research says death penalty doesn't matter in terms of reducing crime. Similar for sentence length and time served. So does it matter that Minnesota sends people to prison for less than Wisconsin in terms of how it affects the crime rate? Most of the studies, in fact, almost all of them, say that these sorts of things don't matter. There's a lot of consensus that the severity of punishment doesn't seem to have a big impact on behavior. Certainty, on the other hand, there is some research supporting it. So when we talked about UCR data, I talked a little bit about clearance rates. And again, the idea is how many homicides happened, how many people were arrested for homicide. It gives you sort of a rough measure of how effective the police are, how likely you are to get punished for a particular crime. Again, most certainty research using the clearance rate up until, I don't know, the 1980s, 90s found nothing going on. In the 90s, there was a couple studies that suggested that if clearance rate gets high enough, and we're talking 30, 40%, that you reach a sort of tipping point. That these were studies of cities. So cities that got a really high clearance rate and that were smaller cities did see a reduction in crime. And that makes a bit of sense. And if you think about how this is supposed to work, people are supposed to kind of catch on to the fact that their odds of getting caught went up. So they say, well, it has to go up quite a bit. And smaller makes sense because word of mouth is going to travel faster. Right? If you live in a small town and clearance rate goes really high, the police are apprehending a bunch of people, it makes sense that crime might go down. So again, I mean, this is just a couple studies, but it's kind of suggestive of sort of if certainty matters, under what conditions would it matter? Um, we have actually manipulated certainty with the criminal justice system, and the classic study done was the Kansas City Preventative Patrol experiment. Um, and so what was done is the city of Kansas City was divvied up into the police beats, and they had three conditions. The uh, purely reactive beats, the police didn't really patrol; they sort of just went in when they needed to go in. And then you had regular patrol, which was regular patrol, and they had a third of the beats that were double patrol. And so since the point of patrolling as a police car is that you project this police presence and hopefully reduce crime, the issue was, did doubling patrol matter? Did not having any patrol matter? And the findings from that 1970s experiment was that it didn't matter a bit. Crime was the same regardless of the beat. It didn't matter if you doubled it or took it away. And it led to Samuel Walker, who's a muckety-muck criminologist, to develop what he called a mayonnaise theory of policing. You just need enough police presence to kind of spread over an area, but that adding more wouldn't actually improve anything. So if you double the mayonnaise, it's not going to make your sandwich taste better. It's just going to make it sort of goopy. Um, we've learned quite a bit since the 70s. And so in the 80s and 90s, one of the things people did was, well, instead of doubling patrol, what happens if we add 10 times the patrol? And so people call these directed patrols or saturation patrols. I was part of, as the data collection, the Houston Preventative Patrol experiment. And so in Houston, they found high crime areas, and they absolutely swamped these areas with police patrol. And so the idea was, can we project such a big presence that crime will go down? And the crime they were most interested in preventing was the armed robbery of the kind of mom and pop convenience stores, and assaults and use of weapons in these high crime areas. And what they found was that indeed that if you put enough cops in a neighborhood for a long enough period of time, they were able to sort of drive down those serious violent crimes, which leads to the Ann Ma's, my wife. Like if I make her a sandwich, I have to double the mayonnaise, and then I double it again, and then she complains that there's not enough mayonnaise. So um, what it suggests is if you dump enough police on there, you can actually have an effect on crime. And again, we're talking serious crimes, we're talking homicide, armed robbery, and those sorts of things. So the upside is it can work, it can suppress serious crime. The downside is that part of what happens is you sort of squish crime into other neighborhoods. And there was some of that in the Houston study, although not enough to say, that all crime was squished out. Um, but also because you're kind of not changing stuff, you're just sort of dampening or suppressing crime, that if you pull back, crime tends to sort of spring back into place. Um, and so in that sense, it's a really, really costly form of crime control. In Houston, the police loved it because they were paid to sort of drive around neighborhoods and turn their lights on and pull people over for sort of minor infractions because they want to project this huge police presence. So the police called it, it was all overtime for them. So they called it driving for dollars. So you had police officers making a couple $100,000 a year doing this. So it was hugely expensive, but in some sense it worked. The other issue is if you have police officers sort of driving around neighborhoods and flashing their lights and pulling people over, but not really arresting people, they tend to pull people over for cracked rear tail light, license plate light not working, didn't turn your signals on, no seatbelt. Um, and frankly, over time, that tends to really piss people off. If your neighborhood gets swamped by police officers and they're constantly pulling you over or stopping you for sort of ticky-tack things, it really angers citizens. And Houston, this is largely done in the Hispanic and black neighborhoods, and largely by white police officers. And so, the potential is that you create these situations where the police-citizen relationships break down. Um, so, again, in terms of what does it tell us about the theory, it tells us that if certainty gets high enough, you can drive down crime. In terms of practical crime control, um, I'm not sure that saturation patrols is a long-term solution. And in fact, this focused deterrent stuff was supposed to be kind of a middle ground between the saturation patrols and the sort of do nothing approach. Uh, so hopefully you read or are going to read the magazine article on this and listen to the podcast. It's a really, really interesting, sort of novel approach. This guy's not a criminologist. He's just a kind of a journalist that got sort of sucked into working on crime-related stories and sort of parlayed that into a research agenda uh, and a sort of program to reduce crime. And so the gist of it's pretty simple. One of his main points is that we spend a lot of time and money manipulating police practices and sort of depending on potential offenders to kind of figure out that something's different. So we double patrol, we triple patrol, we try to get high enough that people realize it. And his point was, well, hell, why not just tell them? Why not just call them in and tell them, hey, things are different. If you do X, Y, or Z crime, we're going to crack down on you really hard. The other part of it is that, and it's a fair point, he makes a point in his book that we've been threatening and threatening and threatening. We're almost like ineffective parents who threaten their kids over and over again and don't really follow through. We're going to get you for this. We're going to get you for that. There's a mandatory sentence for this. And we very rarely follow through. And so it's like a parent who sort of natters and natters and natters, and then bam, they just swat the hell out of their kid. In policing, what we do is we arrest, we don't do anything, and all of a sudden, bang, we send people away to prison for a very long period of time, which is really costly. So his idea is to say, look, let's pick the crimes we're most serious about and crimes for which we have a plan to intervene, and we'll figure out a way to reduce that. And so the Cincinnati and the Boston ones were gang violence amongst juveniles. And basically what they did is they spent time figuring out where the gangs were, who was in them, which gangs were most active, which gangs were most violent. They round up sort of members from every gang, they bring them into these call-ins, and they say, look, there's a new sheriff in town. If you shoot another person, we're going to absolutely tear your gang apart. That's the whole pulling levers approach. Al Capone, as a lot of you know, wasn't arrested for his violence. He was arrested for tax fraud because that's what they could get him with. And so the threat that they have for these people when they call them in is, we are going to come down on every little infraction on your gang that we can possibly get. We're going to round up on probation and parole violations, drug test failures, whatever we can get on any gang member if you shoot somebody. And so then they follow through. The first gang to put a body on the ground, use his language, they crack down on with everything they have. They put most of them in jail or prison, and they do the same thing. And basically what happens is the word on the streets start to believe that, holy crap, if we shoot somebody, this is going to happen. And then shooting goes down. And so it's pretty cool. It's pretty simple. You got to be careful as with other things of not thinking of it as a silver bullet, but it's pretty cool that it can work. And the evidence so far has been fairly persuasive that it does work. The upside is that there's less sort of collateral damage. That unlike saturation patrols or other sort of highly aggressive policing, this is a sort of a surgical strike. That's what makes it focused is it's on a particular drug market in a small area of a neighborhood, or it's on, in the Boston and Cincinnati cases, it's on youth gangs shooting each other. No, it's not like we're threatening gangs that any crime they commit, they're going to go after you. We couldn't do it. If that threat would lose all credibility. It's saying don't shoot other people, and if you shoot somebody, we're going to crack down. In that sense, you're not sort of harassing the whole neighborhood. You're not sort of mixing the law-abiding citizens up with the active offenders. Downside, if you read through the Kennedy stuff and you listen to his audio and you do a little web research, you'll find out that some of these programs have broken down. The Boston one sort of broke down, and the program depends on unlikely allies. It depends on street workers working with prosecutors, working with police, and priests and pastors and ex-gang members, and sometimes those things break down. And the other issue is part of the reason it works is that initially you get this shock and awe that, holy crap, everybody in gangs going to prison. It can get hard to sort of keep that threat sort of real. New gangs emerge that aren't going to take the threat seriously. And so it's going to be interesting. This is a relatively new sort of program, kind of emerged right at the turn of the century. Um, so it's kind of in its infancy in terms of what we know about it from research. Again, pretty promising stuff. Um, all right, so aside from manipulating police, we've looked at what are called perceptual measures of general deterrence. The idea here is that if offenders don't know whether the clearance rate's going up or down, it really doesn't matter. It matters what they think is going on. It's what focused deterrence that we just talked about plays on that the streets have to believe, that people have to believe. And so there's this whole area of research on what do people think the severity is. So they ask people, if you broke into a car, what are the odds you get caught? What do you think would happen to you? And the idea is people who believe that the odds of getting caught are high and the penalties are severe should be less likely to be criminal. And research-wise, it's exactly what we found. The problem is there's kind of two explanations for this, and the non-deterrence one seems to be the one that actually is true. If you think about how this works, right, you ask somebody, what are the odds you get caught if you, I don't know, used Adderall or Ritalin off-label or broke into a car? What happens is the people that actually do this stuff figure out that the odds of getting caught are pretty low. So if you're somebody that uses illicit drugs or uses prescription stimulants off-label, you figure out that you could do this pretty easily without getting caught. Not that I'm recommending doing it. And if you do get caught, usually the initial penalties aren't that stiff. And so the idea is it's not that this first thing up here causes this. It's that people who have experience with crime kind of figure out that the odds of getting caught are pretty low and the punishment isn't as bad as some people think. And that's what folks call an experiential effect. So one of our famous sort of experiments trying to manipulate perceptions of severity is the program Scared Straight. Now A&E, it's called Beyond Scared Straight. Most of you, I'm guessing, have seen some version of this. They take kids in high risk or delinquent kids into an adult prison. Prisoners threaten to rape them and kick the crap out of them and try to show how bad prison is. Then they have a little after follow up with the kid, and most of the kids are sort of repentant and scared straight. I think we'll do a whole sort of section on this at some point. But for now, it's enough for me just to say like, we've got a ton of really good studies since the 1960s. In 1960 to 1990, there's like 9 random trial experiments, and they all show the same thing, that these sorts of programs never have reduced crime, and in fact, a lot of them actually increase crime. That the delinquents who go to Scared Straight, go to the prison, actually get more likely to engage in crime. So, with respect to general deterrence, what do we know? Well, we know a few things, that certainty of punishment matters a lot more than severity, which makes some sense, right? Like if you don't think you're going to get caught, what happens to you when you get caught doesn't really matter. Second is that high levels of certainty are needed to reduce crime. And again, that should make sense, right? That it has to be enough increase in the certainty of getting caught that people realize it's going on, that they believe that their odds of getting caught are higher, and so they change their behavior. And finally, that takes the first two into account. The Kennedy stuff shows that explicit messages work better than sort of implicit threats of sort of raising patrol or changing laws about prison. That you have to actually tell potential offenders that something has changed and that their odds of getting caught have gone up or the severity of punishment has gone up.